Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be discussing WP Statistics. It is a plugin that I see a lot more than I really understand why I see it so much, but it's an interesting plugin and it's not inherently bad, but we need to talk about it in a very real way. WP Statistics is kind of just like running Google Analytics, but instead of using Google Analytics, all that data is collected and funneled into the dashboard. I'm going to start off and just say, honestly, you're better off using Google Analytics. There's no real reason to be collecting analytics this way. The small performance hit of using Google Analytics is much better than the ginormous performance hit that you're going to take using WP Statistics. Especially when you get a larger website, you're going to notice some issues in the growth. We're going to go through the plugin. I'm going to talk about its settings, and I'm going to treat it fairly. I'm going to give you some performance tips that you should be aware of with this plugin. So the overview menu is as it describes. It's just a nice brief overview of the general statistics information for the website. We're not going to play around with this too much, but it's just basically a broad, easy way of showing you what data you collect, where your visitors are coming from, and what means of referrals that they're getting, whether they're coming through any of these search engines. And there are some that are included but not listed by default, and I'll show you what to do with them. So the first menu you get is the hits. Again, this is just a general statistics menu. You're able to sort your data over any lifespan and theory. You can even go all the way up beyond a year to an all-time time frame to whenever you first installed the plugin. I'm not a fan of suggesting users to store their data forever when it comes to using this plugin. You'll get very bloated database tables, but this is an option. The online tab is the collection of online users. It will tell you how long a user has been online by pinging the browser, and it will let you know from what page they were referred. So this is the home page. I'm just going to open up this page, reload it, and in theory, I should start seeing the browser listed under here as well in a little amount of time. The Refers tab allows you to see where your users were referred from. So the top referring sites would be from the site URL staging4.startmedia.com, and the site title was just another WordPress website, and it's been referred one time. This is an easy way of seeing what websites are referring your users. So if you have, maybe you work with a brand or another blog and you have them linked to your site, maybe you sell products, this is a good way of tracking which websites are working and bringing you traffic and which ones are not. It's also useful for figuring out your search engines, which we're going to get to that tab here in a little bit. The search words is just a way of collecting what search terms brought users to your website. It tracks it for all the major search engines: Bing, DuckDuckGo, Google, Yahoo, Yandex, so on and so forth. Keep in mind that this isn't always accurate, and it's not accurate all the time either when you're using something like Google Analytics. Sometimes users' browsers will not send you the information of the search query that they performed to get your website. So just keep in mind, at times you may get data in here that isn't really usable, or it'll just be like unknown, and that's perfectly normal. This happens all the time, and you see it with Google Analytics as well. Search engines allows you to see which search engines are bringing you the majority of your traffic. It's safe to say for almost all scenarios that's going to be Google, and then typically Bing, and then sometimes you'll see DuckDuckGo, Yahoo, and Yandex sending you a good chunk of traffic. If anybody's actually getting most of the traffic from something other than Google, I would be really surprised. But if you're using localized search engines, say you're based in Russia, Yandex would probably give you most of your traffic, and if you were using Baidu as your primary search engine, that's also going to come up in here. Under your Pages tab, this is just a quick view of what pages are performing the best. Since I only checked the home page and that's the data that's been collected, the home page is number one. If you've had this plugin going on for a while, it'll break it down over the respective time period. So the past 30 days, my home page got the most traffic. Maybe your blog post comes up as number one. It depends on your specific website and your visitors' traffic habits. The Visitors tab will actually track data from their referrer information, their IP address, and the browser they were using. Now, if you're concerned about GDPR, you probably should be. There are settings we'll get to briefly talk about it, but I don't really ever recommend logging user IP addresses unless you're doing it for a security purpose, because it is a bit invasive to start logging everyone's IP, and then it also clutters the database, especially if you're collecting IPv6 addresses, which can be quite lengthy. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. The categories tab is, as it mentions, it will show you the category posts that are getting the most views, and it'll break it down per each category. So let's say you have a blog post and you titled it reviews, and this will tell you which category is getting the most views. In this case, the site only has uncategorized, but if you had several categories laid out, this would allow you to figure out which types of categories and which niche of posts are delivering you the most traffic. Tags is exactly the same thing. Authors allows you to see which one of your authors' posts are performing the best. That way you're just able to see. So for the author of Scott, I can pull up the data from the past 30 days and see, okay, he's bringing in 80% of our traffic. He should keep writing. And we have another author over here who, despite writing the same amount of content, either needs to start writing content that's similar or maybe trying something different. This data can be useful in making decisions about whose content is performing, but this is nothing that you couldn't get with Google Analytics and just by cross-referencing the URLs with their respective authors. And the new SiteKit plugin, which I did cover in another video, can pull up the data on the post right then and there, and you'll see which posts are performing the best, and that's just as easy for making educated decisions. Under the browsers, you're able to see which browsers are responsible for most of your traffic and which search and what operating system. So apparently I've had a visitor from somebody who was using Ubuntu, and that was probably the same person who was using Firefox. Not sure how they managed to find the URL, but they did it. This data is something that's not really special. If you're trying to make educated, I don't honestly see why you would want to know what browser your visitors are using, other than to make development decisions. But the general rule of thumb is you build and make sure everything works on Chrome and Firefox, and then your developer swallows a bit of a pill and makes sure that it works on Safari, which is always a lot more difficult, but then you're covered. Old Internet Explorer is far depreciated. Old Edge has been replaced with the new Edge that's based on Google Chrome. You don't need to build for Internet Explorer 8 anymore. There's not a real large business incentive to do that unless you're maintaining an internal application, in which case I don't think you're going to be watching a WordPress video on WP statistics. The top visitor today will tell you how many hits a specific user has brought to your website, and it does this by just simply checking the IP address and saying, okay, this visitor has visited 4 pages. And as it mentions right here, this looks like it's my IP address, I'm imagining, or it could be this one. Windows 10. This one says Windows 6.2. I have no idea what Windows 6.2 is, but it's probably just false data that was collected on the user agent sniffing. I wouldn't worry too much about this. Again, this is another one of those tabs where it's like, the only time you'd need to use this is if you're trying to determine if your website was being DDoSed, I guess. But even then, that's a really bad way of trying to determine and make security decisions. You should definitely be checking your server logs and not the top visitors today in WP statistics for diagnosing any security issues you may be having. Now we're going to get to the tabs that I start to care about, the optimization and the settings tab. The optimization tab sounds like it's a settings tab. It's actually not. It's basically just a general overview of the size of the data, how much memory it's using, the memory limits, the size and number of rows. You can export a table for an output file. So if you're looking to export data from your tables, you can easily do so here. The reason you would do this is to get rid of historical data and to purge it. It's never recommended to use WP statistics forever without cleaning out your database. In fact, you should at least, I wouldn't even try to hold it on for a year, but if you were, export the data, wipe the tables, and then you can go back to collecting it. The reason I don't recommend doing that is when the data collects, then it takes significantly longer for database queries to be run. And it's going to take longer for them to add the data. And the more and more that it adds, the slower it's going to get, the larger the table is going to get, and then you're going to start seeing some real performance issues. I have seen sites that have gone for 6 years using this plugin and have never cleaned the data out. They weren't even using the plugin anymore. There was a point where they had to actually turn the plugin off and deleted it, but they still had huge amounts of data in their database, and they just said, oh, I thought it deleted it when it was uninstalled. But no, you have to delete the data. I'm not a fan of this plugin personally, but don't hold on to the data forever. You can easily purge it out here, and that's all you need to know. You could delete user agents if you wish, which will delete certain data. You could delete it for an IP address. Just don't hold on to the data forever. You could choose to purge records older than any time period in here, so long as it's greater than 30 days. And that's what I would do. I would not hold on to data forever. You're going to run into a lot of performance issues, and that's why I just say go ahead and use Google Analytics or use Jetpack Stats. Use literally anything else to get that data out of your database. You could choose to update the various important details here, mostly for the IP addresses. What this will do is it'll replace IP addresses in the database with hash values. This is good if you're trying to anonymize data, but you will never be able to undo this option. And then for the geo IP options, this will basically just check and make sure that the geo IP settings are up to date, and it will update any unknown location in the database. So basically, if you have a user and the data came back and the country came back as unlisted or unknown, you could try running this tool and it will try to update it and match it to a respective country. If it can't, it'll still be unknown. I wouldn't worry too much about that unless a large percentage of your traffic is coming back as unknown, and then you have either a lot of spam coming through, or you have users who are not sending you their IP information, or you have an issue with the IP lookup in this plugin. We're going to leave it at that. Historical values, the number of historical, as I mentioned here, just leave it to 0. It just don't touch it. You don't need to mess around with this. You should almost never really go around into the optimization tab unless you're purging data. But as it mentions, the number of visits to the site, the current value is 0. You can just go ahead and update this, and it will make changes to the database and set everything to 0 for the historical visits. Now this is where all the important stuff lives, the settings tab, and there are a lot of settings. Let's go ahead and jump into them. So the online users tabs, what this does is it will basically poll the user by default for every 120 seconds. So it'll ping the user's browser every 120 seconds to see if the user is still there. That's every 2 minutes. If you don't have a website where you need to know if users are actively on there, I would disable this option. This option, the more visitors that are on there, can be quite time consuming and resource intensive on the server. Google Analytics has a functionality just like this baked in, and that's what I would use if you need to know if somebody's on the website. That way it's their server having to do all the work and not yours. I wouldn't recommend using this, but 120 seconds sounds like a good default setting to sort of meet in the middle between performance and getting accurate data. You can choose to record all users because by default, this excludes users that are online, so your admins, and it will also include robots and those who are self-referred to the domain. So when I was clicking on the home page and I didn't see myself in the online users tab, that's because the data is excluded because I was logged in. Under the visits tab, you could just choose to enable the visits feature. You need that really, otherwise this plugin's not doing a whole lot for you. The visitors tab, exactly the same thing, and then there's the visitors log. What this will do, you'll receive a report of each of the users' visits to your site. You don't need to mess with any of these really either. Pages and posts, you could choose to enable the pages feature right here. This is what showed you the top 5 trending pages on your website. You'd probably want that to make educated decisions. You get this with SiteKit and so on and so forth. You could choose to track all pages, which would be all WordPress page, whether it's a category, post tag, including your archive pages. You could choose to strip parameters from the URL. What this does is if somebody tries to inject a query string after, or if somebody was referred to a post from, say, Facebook, this will treat it like the same URL. You can test this feature. It should just be a good way of collecting data and to avoid incompatibilities. If you're somebody who uses a lot of UTM tags as well, and you don't want them to be treated as two separate URLs under the pages and post, you can enable this option. It should just treat it like the same URL as the naked URL from your view post URL that you get in WordPress. The hits column, you could choose to enable or disable. These are basically just customization to show you what data you're able to see. But now here's the option that you should check. You should be using some sort of caching plugin on your website. I have covered a bunch of them on this channel, from free ones such as Cache Enabler to paid solutions such as WP Rocket. They are all great plugins, and you're probably using one, in which case you need to check this option. What this will do is it'll then go ahead and try to use the REST API. So we're going to check the yes setting, and I'm going to try and show you how this works. We're going to go to the save, and then we're going to go to settings and permalinks like it requested, and we're going to hit save changes. Now we should see a request to the API, or at least an endpoint that is declared from the plugin. Let's just see. So the WP statistics object is registered. It is calling to the JSON API, and it declares a nonce. We probably would have to log out to see it, so let's go ahead and do that real quick. And then we're going to open up our dev tools, and we are going to go back to this URL, and we're basically just trying to see if it's sending the data like we believe via a request to the WordPress statistics API. There it is. So as you can see, it's using WP JSON, WP statistics, it's using a nonce, and it's sending the data to the backend via the WordPress JSON API. This is going to be inherently faster than trying to do it via Ajax, which a lot of other self-analytics plugins try to do. But if you're on a shared host, this will still be quite slow. And unfortunately, because it's very dynamic based off of your browser specific information, even if you were to deploy the Cloudflare WP JSON cache, it wouldn't do much because the data is going to be very fluid. If I take this URL, for instance, and I copy it, I'm going to reload this page, and then I'm going to see if I can get that same URL. And as you can see, it's not sending that to me. I still get this sort of broken up new JSON response generate every time. So if you're using this, you're going to basically have an uncacheable JSON request going to the backend on every single load. There's nothing you can really do about it. Even a REST API cache plugin will not resolve any slowness that you may experience from using this option, but you have to use this option if you're using a caching plugin. This is why I highly recommend that you just use Google Analytics, so you don't have to worry about that. But you have to check this option if you're using a cache plugin or something like Varnish. And it's still more performant than a plugin trying to use add an Ajax to send this data. So I'm glad that they're using the REST API. That was definitely the right decision on the devs part, but on slower servers, you're definitely going to be feeling the pain. Under the miscellaneous option, you can choose to show stats in your admin bar. SiteKit does this, so if you need that data easily accessible, I actually say go ahead and use this option. You can hide admin notices about non-active features. You can just go ahead and turn this on. That's just stop you from getting annoyed. Search engines, you can choose to add a page title to empty search words. So if a search engine is identified as the referrer, but does not include the query that the user searched to find your website, this will help identify what the user may have been searching for. So basically, if the user searches for your website and the search engine doesn't tell you what query they sent to and that got them to that URL, this will just add a page title to the empty search words tab under the search engine statistics. That way, while you won't be able to know what query they performed, you know where they were sent, and it will just include the page title. So from there, you can try to determine how they found your page. It's a gimmicky feature. It's why it's not enabled by default. By default, though, there are many disabled search engines that you may wish to enable or disable. For instance, if you're in the United States, you may not want to enable Yandex because most US-based websites don't receive any traffic from Yandex, so there's no real reason to track it specifically. That's really all I would change in here. You can also choose to include totals in the charts, but we're not going to mess around with that option. Now we're going to start going into the other settings. For the visitor IP address, this is basically a tab to just check what option that the plugin can use to retrieve the IP address of the user. If you're using Cloudflare, for instance, you would not be able to just use the default option. You would have to use something like HTTPX forwarded for, and then that would give you the real IP address of the user. Under the privacy tab, you could choose to anonymize IP addresses. You're going to want this if you're using GDPR. You're going to have to enable this option. You can also choose to hash IP addresses. So it will not store the IP address in the database, but it will store a hash. You will never be able to figure out what the IP address was, but you'll get a unique hash generated for every IP. The advantage to that is it's technically going to be more, how would you say, it's going to be more privacy oriented, but you won't be able to get a lot of features worked out. So the IP address won't be saved in your database. It'll just create a randomized hash. If the same user visits and they have the same IP address, the hash would be the same. So you could check the hash and then it should work just fine. Whatever you use here, honestly, is just fine. And then you could choose to store the entire user agent string. You should never do this. You're not going to get any useful data out of you storing the entire user agent string. User agent strings can be faked relatively easily. It's not a good means of trying to determine most things. Google Chrome is also trying to work on a feature that basically hides the user agent data. So this is going to see a lot of change in the coming years or months even. So just keep this in mind. Notifications, it'll send you general notice information. You could choose what kind of reports you get. The dashboard section allows you to enable and disable various widgets that you'll see. Choose to disable the maps. You could choose whatever you want in here. It's just customization. Access levels allows you to set what options somebody has to have permissions to modify to see the statistics information. So if you want to give somebody the ability to view statistics info, they have to have the capabilities for the manage options. And you can go ahead and modify this to something like create a post. So if you set to create post or really publish post, and then anybody who's an author or above would be able to get access to this. If you wanted to do something like read, well, everybody can read it. So even subscribers would be able to get access to your statistics. In fact, it looks like they give you a hint right here that can help you figure that out. You just modify this if you need to allow somebody who's not an administrator or editor access to your statistics information. The exclusions, this allows you to exclude user roles from generating as well as IP addresses and user agents. And then you could even use a honeypot if you're looking to identify bots. This is just ways of filtering your data so that way it doesn't get any junk or useless data in there. It takes a lot of the work out of it because they have strong defaults for blocking the most common bots, but I wouldn't really mess around with this unless you needed to. I'm not a fan of this plugin, but I know a lot of you use it. The Matimo Refer Spam Blacklist, what this will do is it's a blacklist that will be downloaded and used to detect if the referrer is spam. So sometimes what bots will do is they will purposely send referrer spam. If you've ever used Blogger, you'll get data about referrals to your website. But what happens is websites will fake an actual referral from their URL, so that way it purposely shows up in your statistics, and then you click on the URL and you go to their website. It's a very weird tactic, but you will get referrer spam. This kind of just helps you avoid getting referrer spam so it doesn't come into your statistics. I do recommend you use this, and I also recommend you set up a schedule for a weekly update of the blacklist. You can go ahead and choose to enable the GeoIP collection and the GeoIP city, and this data is provided by MaxMind. It's the same thing that WooCommerce used. You could go ahead and just mess around with this if you wish. If you're trying to do GeoIP lookups, I would not do this from a privacy point of view, but if you want more useful statistics, you can feel free to go ahead and modify this. Maintenance tab. Now here we go. This is what everybody should use if they have this plugin. Under the maintenance, enable the purge old data daily. What this will do is every day it will set a cron that will delete data that is older than the field you set here. So if you set this, data will only be stored for 365 days. So let's say I'm looking at 1 year ago from today. It would be 4/21/2019. Tomorrow, when it becomes 4/22/2020, then the 4/21 data would be erased from last year. And it would just do this every day. Every day that data from 365 days ago gets deleted and deleted and deleted. And that way you're reducing your database size by not saving any old data. And you can export the data, as we saw under the optimization tab. But I would just make sure that you have the purge set up. 365 days is totally acceptable if you're not using something like Google Analytics for some reason. I would just use Google Analytics so that way you don't ever have to worry about your data needing to be erased because now your database size is getting really large. But this is totally acceptable. You can also choose to do the exact same thing for the purge high hit count visitors daily. The default is totally acceptable. You'll just go ahead here, and once a day it will delete the visitors with more than 50 hits. That's totally fine. Finally, there is the removal tab. The removal tab is, as it mentions, how you officially delete everything. They will delete global options and settings, but this actually will keep all other data. So what this does is it will remove your settings that you have in the plugin, but it will keep the other data. But if you choose to remove the data and settings, what this does is once the plugin's installed, all of the data gets erased. That is the preferred option if you're trying to uninstall this plugin. You go in here and you delete it. Otherwise, you're going to have to open up your PHPMyAdmin or whatever your host is using, and then you're going to have to start deleting them individually by dropping the tables from your database. This is just easier. If you have it installed, go ahead and remove the data, drop it, and use whatever other means of analytics collection that you can find. That is everything in this plugin. There are paid add-ons, but we're not going to talk about those because this is just strictly for the free plugin. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.